In 1973, the Eldfell volcano tore through the earth, vomiting 400 million cubic meters of lava and millions of tons of ash that buried a third of the town of Heimaey. But instead of abandoning this fractured land completely, 4,000 residents chose to return. They calmly drill pipes directly into the cooling lava rock, drawing residual heat from a fire that has been burning for 50 years, to warm the very houses rebuilt on the ashes of their former lives. This journey will take you to the edge of the world, where human beings do not conquer nature, but learn to dance with destruction. We will explore how an isolated community turns a catastrophic threat into a source of life. Your footsteps will guide you through one of the most violent oceanic environments on the planet. Imagine waking up at 6 in the morning, not to the sound of birds, but to the deafening roar of a North Atlantic autumn storm. These low-pressure systems, known locally as houseflag, hurl winds of up to 150 kilometers per hour, whipping salt, sea spray, and ice directly onto the shoreline. In this environment, survival begins before you even step outside. The architecture of Heimaey is not born of aesthetic desire, but of absolute atmospheric necessity. Houses here are armored with corrugated iron cladding called barujarn, reinforced with heavy-duty rivets. Double vacuum-sealed windows are standard, serving as the only transparent barrier. Inside, the warmth you feel is not generated by burning expensive imported wood or coal. It is the direct result of the hitaveita, a geothermal circulation system born from catastrophe. Pumping stations force water through an underground network of pipes buried deep beneath the Eldfell volcano. Down there, the core temperature of the basaltic rock still hovers around 400 degrees Celsius. The water absorbs this immense thermal energy and carries it silently into the floorboards and radiators of every bedroom in the valley. The enemy that once destroyed their town is now the silent guardian that keeps them from freezing in the dark. The morning ritual here is dictated by the physiological demands of a land deprived of sunlight. During the deep winter, the sun barely crests the horizon for 4 fleeting hours a day. To combat the severe lack of vitamin D and the encroaching Arctic darkness, every resident begins their day with a spoonful of lisi, a potent cod liver oil. This thick, golden liquid is a biological shield against the psychological and physical wear of extreme isolation. Breakfast is functional, calorie-dense, and deeply rooted in preservation. A dense slice of dark rye bread, baked slowly underground using geothermal heat, is paired with hartfisker. This wind-dried fish is tough, requiring intense chewing, but it delivers a massive concentration of protein needed for the physical labor ahead. Every calorie consumed is a calculated defense against the freezing winds, waiting just beyond the reinforced doors. The wind outside does not merely blow. It seeks out structural weaknesses, testing the resilience of both iron and the human mind. Yet, sitting inside these fortified homes, there is a profound sense of quietude. It is the calm of a people who have accepted their vulnerability and engineered a way to exist within it. As you look out through the vacuum-sealed glass, the landscape is a There are no forests here to break the wind. The island of Heimaey is a solitary rock jutting out of the North Atlantic, entirely exposed to the wrath of the ocean. This geographical isolation forces a unique economic and biological cycle upon its inhabitants. The sea is their only real harvest, yet it is also their greatest predator. Leaving the safety of the hitaveita warmed home means stepping onto a battlefield of atmospheric pressure and rogue waves. The air pressure drops rapidly as the house length intensifies, causing physical fatigue and a sharp drop in ambient temperature. The human body must immediately divert blood flow from the extremities to the vital organs, just to maintain a core temperature of 37 degrees. This biological reality makes thick wool garments not a cultural fashion statement, but a critical life support system. The traditional Icelandic wool sweater, the lopapeysa, is woven from two distinct layers of sheep hair. The coarse outer fibers, called tog, repel the freezing ocean spray, while the soft inner fibers, the thell, trap a layer of insulating air against the skin. When a fisherman steps out into the 150 km/h gusts, this wool is the only thing standing between him and rapid hypothermia. The walk to the harbor is not a casual stroll, but a tactical maneuver against the wind. You must lean into the gusts, planting your boots firmly onto the abrasive basaltic ground, calculating every step to avoid being swept off your feet. The volcanic ash beneath your boots is a constant reminder of the fragile crust you walk upon. This ash is porous, absorbing the freezing rain instantly, leaving the ground hardened and slick with black ice. Every aspect of this morning routine, from the spoonful of cod liver oil to the specific weave of the wool, is a specialized adaptation. These are not people merely surviving a harsh climate. They have integrated the extreme variables of their environment into their cellular routine. They understand that the island does not belong to them. They merely borrow space on its surface, paying rent through constant vigilance and respect for the natural forces that could erase them in an instant. As you approach the harbor, the true scale of their existence becomes undeniable. The port is sheltered by colossal cliffs of jagged lava rock, formed abruptly during the 1973 eruption, the very disaster that nearly destroyed the harbor, ultimately created a narrower, more protected entry point from the chaotic sea. The geological trauma of the Earth provided an unintended logistical advantage. Massive steel-hulled fishing vessels, scarred by years of impact with floating ice and corrosive saltwater, are moored tightly against the concrete piers. The saltwater here is so dense and cold that it accelerates the oxidation of any exposed metal, requiring constant, grueling maintenance. The men and women who work these docks do not speak in loud voices, as the wind instantly tears the sound from their mouths. Instead, they communicate through a synchronized understanding of the machinery and the ocean's rhythm. The ropes used to secure these vessels are thick, heavy, and often frozen stiff, requiring immense physical strength to manipulate. Every movement is deliberate, stripped of wasted energy, focused entirely on the immediate task of preparation. The sea does not forgive mistakes, and the people of Heimaey do not make them lightly. This is the reality of living on a geological time bomb, suspended in a freezing ocean. It is a life defined by stark contrasts. The freezing wind against the geothermal heat, the black ash against the white snow, the violent sea against the quiet resilience of the human spirit. The massive steel vessels leave the harbor. The entrance is a treacherous channel only 160 meters wide, framed by the jagged lava flow of the 1973 eruption. The tidal currents here are violently compressed by the narrow geography, forcing the water to accelerate into turbulent eddies. Fishermen must calculate the exact timing of their exit, reading the swelling waves and the backwash off the basalt walls, to avoid being smashed against the rocks. Once in the open ocean, the real physical extraction begins. The Vestmannaeyjar archipelago is surrounded by highly oxygenated, nutrient-rich waters. Due to the turbulent mixing of the warm Gulf Stream and the freezing East Greenland current. This biological collision creates a massive feeding ground for cod, haddock, and halibut. However, the very thermal contrast that brings life to these waters also generates unpredictable and lethal weather systems. The physical toll on the human body while working these decks is immense and continuous. Hauling heavy, saltwater-soaked nets in sub-zero temperatures causes the synovial fluid in the joints to thicken, making every movement a painful exertion of force. The skin on the fisherman's hands thickens and cracks, heavily calloused by the constant friction against frozen synthetic ropes and icy steel winches. But extracting protein from the freezing ocean is only one dimension of their survival geometry. When the seas become too violent to navigate, the residents turn their attention upward to the sheer vertical cliffs of the islands. This introduces the ancient, gravity-defying practice known as sprang. The basaltic cliffs of Heimaey rise hundreds of meters, straight out of the churning ocean. These fractured geological formations provide the ideal nesting grounds for millions of seabirds, primarily the Atlantic puffin. For centuries, collecting seabirds and their eggs was not a sport or a cultural display. It was a strict mathematical necessity for caloric survival, when winter storms made fishing impossible. To harvest this resource, the men of the island engage in a perilous vertical dance. They utilize thick, multi-stranded ropes securely anchored to deep crevices at the very edge of the volcanic precipice. A single man lowers himself down the sheer cliff face. He does not simply hang in place. He uses the kinetic energy of his own body. By pushing off the rock wall with his legs, he creates a pendulum motion, swinging in wide, sweeping arcs across the vertical surface. This precise aerodynamic movement allows him to reach isolated, narrow ledges covered in slippery, nitrogen-rich guano, without the exhausting process of constantly ascending and descending. The primary tool for this vertical hunt is the flagastang, or hoffer. It is a long, flexible wooden pole equipped with a specialized, shaped net at the far end. Operating this tool while suspended hundreds of meters above churning white water requires extraordinary core strength and an intuitive, almost biological understanding of localized wind patterns. The hunter must anticipate the sudden thermal updrafts that bounce off the sun-heated cliff face. He sweeps the net through the air, catching the birds mid-flight with clinical, calculated precision. A single miscalculation of the wind's velocity, a sudden drop in atmospheric pressure, or a momentary lapse in grip strength means an uninterrupted and fatal fall into the freezing Atlantic below. The harvest from the sea and the cliffs is then subjected to rigorous and ancient preservation methods. In an environment where vegetation is sparse, the soil is thin, and hardwood for smoking is practically non-existent, the locals had to develop a chemical adaptation to preserve their meat through the long winters. They utilize dried sheep dung, a resource that is abundant, completely renewable, and burns with a slow, smoldering intensity. The dung is compressed into solid blocks and burned in sealed sheds to create a dense, low-temperature, highly aromatic smoke. This process is used to create tadreikt hangikjöt, the traditional smoked lamb. The smoke from the burning dung contains specific phenolic compounds and organic acids that slowly penetrate the muscle fibers of the meat. This chemical process not only dehydrates the flesh, stripping away the moisture required for bacterial growth, but also imparts a sharp, deeply earthy flavor that is entirely unique to the Icelandic countryside. Returning home after a day of relentless physical exhaustion on the cliffs or the ocean, the evening meal is a critical restoration of thermal energy. A boiling cast iron pot of plokkfiskar, a dense, heavy stew made of mashed whitefish, potatoes, onions, and rich dairy fat provides the necessary carbohydrates and lipids to replenish the body's severely depleted reserves. As night falls and the temperature drops rapidly, the true, inescapable isolation of Heimaey sets in. The island is entirely at the mercy of the National Meteorological Station's warnings. When a red weather alert is broadcast, the invisible atmospheric walls around the community solidify into a physical prison. The Herjólfur ferry, their only mechanical lifeline to the Icelandic mainland, immediately ceases operation. The small, crosswind battered airstrip is entirely shut down. The island of 4,000 people is effectively and completely cut off from the rest of humanity, left to face the approaching storm alone. During these periods of atmospheric lockdown, the violent nature of the environment shapes the psychological and neurological development of the next generation. Children born on Heimaey do not experience extreme weather as a mere inconvenience. They learn to understand the weather as a dominant, omnipresent predator. From the moment they can walk steadily on the uneven volcanic earth, they are instructed on the raw physics of the wind. They are explicitly taught never to stand upright when a queither, a sudden, massive, and localized gust of wind, strikes the island. Instead, they learn the immediate survival reflex to drop down and press their bodies entirely flat against the ground. They dig their heavily mittened fingers into the porous black volcanic ash. They instinctively minimize their body's surface area to prevent being physically lifted and thrown into the rocky terrain by the sheer aerodynamic force of the storm. They are rigorously trained to navigate through whiteouts. These are terrifying meteorological conditions where blowing snow completely obliterates all visual references, blending the sky and the ground into a disorienting, featureless void of white. In a true whiteout, the human brain loses its fundamental ability to distinguish depth, direction, or distance, leading quickly to panic and fatal exposure. The children learn to suppress this panic. They rely instead on the tactile feedback of the hardened ground beneath their heavy boots and the specific direction of the freezing wind against their faces, to slowly, methodically find their way back to the reinforced iron walls of their homes. Inside these heavily armored homes, as the storm violently tears at the roof tiles, and rogue sneaker waves violently erode the basalt coastline just hundreds of meters away, there is a profound lack of panic. The family gathers around the central geothermal radiator, finding a profound sense of comfort in the steady, mechanical hum of the hitaveita system. This is a closed ecosystem of survival, where the extreme external threat actively reinforces internal social bonds. The physics of this geothermal transfer are a marvel of localized engineering. The superheated water, extracted from the subterranean volcanic aquifer, travels through heavily insulated, corrosion-resistant titanium pipes. As it reaches the domestic heat exchangers, the thermal energy is transferred to clean, fresh water, which then circulates through the intricate network of underfloor capillaries. This constant radiant heat is not merely a physical luxury. It is a critical psychological anchor. It provides a stark, tangible contrast to the deadly thermal drain, occurring just millimeters away on the outside of the window panes. Inside this artificially sustained microclimate, the family does not distract themselves with trivial, manufactured anxieties. The raw power of the storm outside demands absolute presence of mind. Instead of yielding to the sensory deprivation caused by the whiteout conditions, they actively engage in the ancient oral tradition known as kvoldvaka. Historically, this was the vital evening wake, a time when extended families would sit together in the dim light of whale oil lamps. They would spend hours carding, spinning, and knitting the raw sheep wool into the life-saving lopapesa garments. Simultaneously, the most articulate member of the household would recite the epic Icelandic sagas from worn, leather-bound manuscripts. Today, the physical tools of labor may have evolved, but the underlying neurological and social mechanism remains identical. They share detailed narratives of their ancestors, the men and women who survived far worse winters. Without the aid of modern geothermal engineering or satellite weather tracking, these narratives are not merely historical entertainment. They serve as a highly effective, intergenerational psychological conditioning tool. They systematically normalize the constant presence of extreme danger. They frame the catastrophic potential of the ocean and the volcano, not as a localized curse, but as the fundamental, inescapable baseline of their existence. The children sit quietly, absorbing these complex tales of the Hulderfolk, the hidden people believed to reside deep within the fractured lava rocks. These myths are essentially encoded survival manuals, teaching the young a profound, cautious respect for the unseen and unpredictable forces of the localized landscape. Outside, the North Atlantic continues its relentless mechanical assault on the island's perimeter. The most terrifying manifestation of this kinetic energy is the phenomenon of the sneaker waves. These are not ordinary tidal swells, but massive anomalous walls of water, generated by the constructive interference of complex underwater topography and distant, overlapping storm systems. They travel thousands of miles across the open ocean, gathering momentum without breaking, until they detonate against the steeply sloping basaltic shelf of the southern coast. These waves are practically invisible to the naked eye until the very last second of impact. They are capable of surging tens of meters vertically up the sheer cliffs, possessing enough hydraulic force to drag massive, multi-ton boulders back into the churning abyss. The residents of Heimaey know the exact acoustic signature of these impacts intimately. They do not just hear the crash. They feel the low-frequency seismic vibrations transferring directly through the solid bedrock and into their living room floors. Yet, despite this constant physical reminder of their proximity to annihilation, they sleep soundly. Their sense of security is deeply rooted in their precise understanding of the structural integrity of their corrugated iron and the geographical shielding provided by the very volcano that nearly erased them. When the barometric pressure finally begins to stabilize, and the violent house length slowly moves eastward toward the European mainland, the island undergoes a rapid and dramatic atmospheric transformation. The violent, deafening kinetic energy of the storm is suddenly replaced by an absolute freezing stillness that feels almost heavy against the eardrums. The thick, aggressive cloud cover fractures and dissipates, revealing the vast, unpolluted, and freezing expanse of the Arctic night sky. Because Heimaey is situated far from the artificial light pollution of the mainland, the celestial mechanics are perfectly, crisply visible through the thin, freezing air. It is in this absolute darkness that the aurora borealis begins its silent, mesmerizing descent. This is not magic, but a massive, highly energetic chemical reaction occurring in the ionosphere. Solar wind, carrying billions of highly charged electrons and protons ejected from the sun's corona, collides violently with the Earth's magnetic field directly above the archipelago. These charged particles are funneled down along the magnetic field lines, where they violently strike the oxygen and nitrogen molecules suspended in the upper atmosphere. This high-altitude collision excites the atoms, forcing them to release excess kinetic energy in the form of brilliant, dancing photons of light. Massive, undulating ribbons of luminous green, shifting into deep violet and pale pink, sweep majestically across the black canvas of space. They cast a ghostly, shifting glow over the jagged, snow-capped peak of Eldfell. The very volcano that once buried this town in an apocalypse of fire now stands as a dark, majestic, and silent silhouette against the celestial light show. It is a moment of profound, almost painful visual satisfaction. A silent, breathtaking compensation from the universe for the sheer brutality of the preceding days. When dawn finally breaks over the newly calmed ocean, the island transitions immediately back into a state of hyperproductive labor. The men emerge from their heavily reinforced homes, their eyes scanning the horizon for any lingering atmospheric anomalies. They walk back to the harbor, where the massive steel vessels have survived the night, groaning against the heavy mooring lines. The salt water that crashed over the decks during the storm has now frozen solid, encasing the winches and hydraulic cranes in thick, heavy armor of clear ice. The crew must spend hours methodically striking the machinery with heavy iron mallets, carefully fracturing the ice without damaging the sensitive mechanical components beneath. Every pulley, every synthetic net, and every steel cable must be rigorously inspected for microfractures caused by the extreme thermal contraction. Failure to detect a weakened link now could mean a catastrophic equipment failure. When they are miles offshore, hauling tons of thrashing cod from the deep water, this meticulous maintenance is not a chore. It is a sacred ritual of survival. A recognition that their lives depend entirely on the flawless function of their tools. They work in synchronized silence, their breath pluming in the freezing air, their movements precise and calculated to conserve precious bodily warmth. This is the relentless, cyclical reality of Heimaey. A continuous oscillation between violent atmospheric assault and frantic, focused industrial extraction. The history of Heimaey is not a simple, linear tragedy of human subjugation to natural disasters. It is a monumental, ongoing epic of unparalleled biological, engineering, and psychological adaptation. The people who inhabit this fractured rock do not harbor any illusions of attempting to conquer the North Atlantic. Nor do they attempt to run from or suppress the tectonic volatility that churns just beneath their boots. Instead, they have meticulously learned the complex, unforgiving mechanics of extreme survival. They have literally synced their own biological heartbeats to the brutal, unpredictable rhythm of the Earth's crust. They capture and utilize the residual fire of their greatest geological enemy to warm the blood of their children. They master the terrifying verticality of the deadly cliffs to extract enough protein to sustain their physical bodies through the dark months. They stand on the edge of the world as a living, breathing testament to the sheer, stubborn resilience of the human species. When you look closely at the black, porous, and seemingly dead ash covering the island's surface, you will eventually notice something extraordinary. You will see a tiny, incredibly resilient green shoot of Arctic moss, known locally as mosabreda. It is slowly, painfully, but relentlessly pushing its way through the freezing, nutrient-starved volcanic crust. It uses specialized cellular antifreeze proteins to prevent its own tissues from rupturing in the sub-zero temperatures. It is a perfect, silent biological mirror of the people who call this island home. It proves definitively that life, no matter how hostile or violently fluctuating the external conditions may be, will always find a specific, highly adapted way to anchor itself and thrive. If your spirit is currently suffocating under the sterile, predictable, and heavily insulated weight of the modern world, perhaps it is time to recalibrate your senses. Perhaps it is time to step out into the freezing, unfiltered wind of reality. Let this journey guide you to the furthest, most isolated edges of the map. We will continue to seek out these extraordinary places to discover the raw, unvarnished essence of human survival. Let these isolated, storm-battered corners of the Earth remind you of what it truly requires to be alive, and what humanity is capable of enduring. In our next expedition, we will leave the dark volcanic heat of the Atlantic entirely behind. We will plunge deep into the blinding white realm of eternal permafrost, following the fading tracks of a nomadic tribe as they prepare to confront a massive, ancient apex predator moving silently beneath the thick black